Oreo cookies lowered my cholesterol by over 70% in about 2 weeks, which was more than twice as powerful as the statin treatment. It's clickbait, but it's clickbait with a purpose and genuine, mind-blowing physiology underneath.
Nick Norwitz, the Harvard-trained doctor who turns himself into the experiment.
He's exposing how traditional science fails.
And is revealing the truth about nutrition.
You can be at the helm of your metabolic health ship. Ketogenic diet probably did save my life from pretty debilitating inflammatory bowel disease. And so I would say anybody struggling with an autoimmune, inflammatory, or metabolic health condition should consider this in their arsenal of tools to try. People get this idea of like this small, dense LDL like sneaking in versus the large, buoyant bouncing off like a marshmallow. It's not how it works. Instead, I ate 720 eggs in a month and my cholesterol didn't change.
Did you get sick of eating that many eggs a day?
Eggs are incredibly nutritious. You could have so many different meals with eggs, and I didn't get tired of eggs at all.
The carnivore diet, do you think that's going to be healthy longer term? What do you think are the best foods that people should eat if they really want those nutrient-dense foods to change their life?
Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I will say it. It took me so long to figure that out, and when I did, my life completely changed.
Today I'm joined by Harvard-trained scientist Dr. Nick Norwitz, who is known for testing health theories on himself, and his latest 2 experiments were extreme. He ate 720 eggs in 30 days. That's over 133,000 milligrams of cholesterol. He also did a second experiment, 12 Oreos a day for 30 days to see the impact on his LDL cholesterol. So in this episode, we're going to break down Dr. Norwitz's results and the science of cholesterol and see the impact of eating all this cholesterol on his heart health and what that means for you in terms of heart attacks and strokes. So Dr. Norwitz, my first question. You are known for all these crazy experiments, as I mentioned, the Oreos and the egg experiment. With all that being said, what mission are you on?
That's a great question, Rena. I will say I don't do them just for attention, not in the shallow sense. I think modern medicine is very conservative, and that has pros and cons. But sometimes when there's a novel finding, a hint of something that is truly extraordinary that deserves to be explored, a convention turns a blind eye to it. And I have a unique privilege being a young scientist and an MD coming up in this era, because there's all this freedom of information. There's this new tool or set of tools we have, social media, to communicate directly with the public and then use the public's enthusiasm to direct a bottom-up driver for like scientific interest. So I don't have millions of dollars, to conduct these huge studies, but I do have some brands, some creativity, and access to social media. So what I've done historically is, or toyed with, social experiments. Can I bring attention to topics that are fascinating and that I think deserve further study and discussion by doing these stunts? So what really drove me to do the first one, which is the Oreo versus statin study, is some colleagues and I were studying this phenomenon that occurs when some people, particularly actually the lean people and the insulin-sensitive, metabolically healthy people, go low-carb keto and see their LDL just absolutely skyrocket. Their quote-unquote bad cholesterol skyrocket. It's kind of like a medical boogeyman, but people don't understand why it's happening. And we were starting to understand. We had a model. We had multiple lines of evidence, including randomized controlled trial level evidence, so a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And this is the kind of stuff that, look, we're not trying to hoard this story or data or avoid getting swooped in the literature. Like, we want support and rigorous discussion and debate, but it was just being ignored. And so I'm an impatient person by nature. So rather than being like, all right, let's see if this takes off in 5 to 10 years, I'm like, actually, maybe we can stir the pot a little bit. Productive provocation, if you will. So that brought me to my first social experiment. At this point, I only had an X account. I didn't have any other social media, no Instagram, basically no YouTube presence. But I'm like, if we understand this physiology correctly, and I'm one of these people, lean, insulin sensitive, went keto, my LDL went through the roof. It's not a saturated fat or fiber phenomenon, data on that as well. If we understand this, then I should be able to generate a metabolic scenario where I can do things that seem very odd. And one would be to lower my cholesterol with any carb. And so I thought, okay, what is the most click-worthy carb I can think of? Unhealthy food, well-branded. I'm like, Oreo cookies. I can't think of anything that tops Oreo cookies. Everybody knows Oreos, and everybody knows Oreos like aren't a health food. So if one were to demonstrate you can lower your cholesterol massively with Oreo cookies, that should catch headlines. Tack on to that, the person doing it is, a PhD, MD student at the time at Harvard. Then the headlines will run with it. That was the prediction. So this was a social experiment for me, but this wasn't a matter of let me collect the data and if it works out, let me publicize it. No, I wanted to do this honestly. So what I did, because I know how to dot my I's and cross my T's, is I planned the study. I got expert lipidologist, Professor William Cromwell, to consult and help design the study. My primary care physician was ordering all my labs into my electronic medical records, so there was no fabricating this. And then I went to Harvard's Institutional Review Board and said, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm telling you a priori, I'm going to do this. Can you authorize it? Or in this case, give me an IRB exemption because it's a self-experiment. They said, sure, here's your IRB exemption letter. So then I announced it and then I did it. And the results were, we were right. The Oreo cookies lowered my cholesterol by over 70% in about 2 weeks, which was more than twice as powerful as the statin treatment, which I did for 6 weeks just to give the statins, a longer shot. The actual study was Oreo phase ended up being 16 days, then a long washout period to kind of reset. So 3 months, and then 6 weeks of gorilla statin. So gorilla dose, 20 mgs Crestor, very high dose statin. And yeah, the Oreos were better at lowering my cholesterol than the statin. And so that was my first stunt, and it achieved its aim, which was to get discussion going around this phenomenon. The aim was not to say or put any value judgment on LDL or statins. At no point do I do so. But you can predict people's emotional response and play with it a little bit. And I'll be transparent. That was totally intentional. And guess what? It worked. And what has spiraled out of that is a lot of discussion, partnerships, and more research. So, these goofy headlines that run they're trolling people. Actually, yeah, it's clickbait, but it's clickbait with a purpose and genuine mind-blowing physiology underneath. And the one thing I'll add before I get off my soapbox is I think people like to, wonder not just about what's happening on social media, but behind the scenes in academia. And I will tell you, after this came out, the number of very productive discussions I had through the halls of Harvard and in the hospitals with senior residents and attendings who wanted to know how this works, so they can understand the physiology and even apply it to their own patients, it was remarkable. So it was a very positive outcome.
Okay, I do want to talk about the egg experiment, but let's first understand this Oreo experiment. So eating 12 Oreos a day, it lowered your LDL cholesterol. So can you explain the mechanism at which that did that? Because you added the 12 Oreos to your already keto diet. Not saying that people should do this, but what is the mechanism of how that's happening?
So first things first, biomarkers, LDL, triglycerides, whatever biomarker you want to select. They need to be taken in the context of other markers in an individual's scenario. A biomarker can change for many different reasons. LDL can change for many different reasons. You can have a genetic dysfunction. You can change your metabolic status. And some people, they're sensitive to saturated fat, X, Y, Z. And the cause and context of the change in the biomarker is incredibly important for how it is going to influence physiology, risks, outcomes. And so the population we're studying has these giant spikes in LDL, but for a reason that is very different than anything else known in medicine to date for explaining LDL levels that high. In fact, to have LDL levels as high as mine gets, which it can get over 500 milligrams per deciliter if you want the number, there's no other current explanation in conventional wisdom other than you have a genetic mutation. But in all those circumstances, people have high LDL from birth. It's a congenital defect. It's called familial hypercholesterolemia. I do not have that. My LDL on a mixed diet, say if I'm eating, Oreos and burgers, is like 90. But when I carb restrict, it goes up. So this is a whole new phenomenon. And the thing we think is happening is in lean, insulin-sensitive people, we can get into why that population in particular, there's a massive upregulation of fat trafficking as you shift from carb metabolism to fat metabolism because you're not eating carbs, so you're burning fat as fuel. And the system that is used to traffic the fat around the body uses LDL, or actually precursors to the LDL particles, as boats to carry the fat around in the bloodstream. So what happens is your fat cells, they release free fatty acids. This is fuel your muscles can burn. And then the free fatty acids are circulating around in the bloodstream. A lot of them get taken back up into the liver. And then to recirculate around the body, they get put in their storage form. It's called a triglyceride. It's like little 3 fatty acids put on a little backbone. It looks like a molecular M. But this isn't soluble in water. It's like oil and vinegar. They don't mix. So you need a carrying particle. And so your liver generates these very low density lipoproteins, VLDL. The VLDL bring the triglycerides, the free fatty acid storage form, back to fat cells and muscle cells and dump them off. And they dump them off very, very quickly. So what happens is the VLDL gets turned over, degraded. And the phenomenon that results is a lot more LDL, because you're turning over the VLDL very quickly, and then the LDL, they linger in the blood longer than the VLDL. And then also, these VLDLs are these big spheres, and as you shrink a sphere, as you're pulling the fat fuel out of the center, the sphere gets smaller, so VLDL to LDL, but also you decrease the surface area, right? You've shrunken the sphere, so surface components pop off, including cholesterol that gets picked up by HDL. So what you end up with, and we have a paper on this, you can Google lipid energy model on PubMed and you can get the diagrams, but is a phenomenon of very high LDL, but along with that, a pattern of high HDL and low triglycerides. So it ends up being this metabolic triad: very high LDL, very high HDL, low triglycerides. That's the phenomenon. But, if that went over everybody's head, the core point here is this all kicks off because you carb restrict. So if you give back carbs, fruit, syrup, honey, Oreo cookies, it should reduce the driving force for this whole mechanism, and the LDL should drop. So that was the prediction. And just to be clear, we'd actually done a clinical case series on patients that are of this phenotype and given them, it wasn't me, it was another physician, but we published on this case series, just like fruits and starches, and this worked. But that never caught headlines because, fruit lowers LDL isn't as sexy as Harvard scientist lowers LDL with Oreo cookies. So people ask, why the Oreo cookies? Why didn't you use fruit? I'm like, well, we had already done that. Nobody was paying attention. So I did what I thought would get the attention that it ended up getting.
It's interesting that doing the Oreo experiment, that it's lowering the LDL. So question for you. You did this experiment and then also the egg experiment, which we're going to talk about. So then, as a Harvard-trained scientist, is LDL the cause of cardiovascular risk?
This is something we can talk about for many hours. People will probably anticipate what I'm going to say, and they're probably going to be wrong. I'm going to say yes, but with a caveat. Cause is probably the word in cardiology, and maybe the metabolic health space most broadly, that is most abused and misunderstood. And I do not mean by that correlation is not equal to causation. I'm guessing your audience has probably heard that phrase and understands it, so I'm going to assume some knowledge there. What I mean by that is causality is not equal to importance. So causality, as defined, is something is causal for something else. It's part of the causal cascade. It does not mean that this is something that needs to be treated, if that makes sense. So I'll give you an analogy. I recently did a response video to Peter Attia. We can link it if people want, because it's literally about the word causality. It's 10 minutes of me talking about the word causality, but you can draw different analogies and they can give different and maybe misleading suggestions. So for example, the analogy he gives is smoking is causal to lung cancer. Therefore, you should not smoke to reduce your lung cancer risk. And then he extrapolates that to LDL cholesterol, and more particularly ApoB, is causal to cardiovascular disease. So therefore, it's quote unquote idiotic not to lower ApoB because it's causal. And if you lower it, then you're lowering heart disease risk. If you just listen to those analogies, it kind of makes sense. But now let me unpack this a little bit more. Let's dissect the analogy of this causality. So if X causes Y, reduce X to reduce the risk of Y, right? You can put other things as X and Y. So I can put oxygen in fire for X and Y. Oxygen is causal, or let's say like necessary for fire to occur. So should I reduce the oxygen in my environment to reduce my risk of spontaneous combustion? No, obviously not, because while X is causal to Y, targeting X and reducing X doesn't actually give you an indication of how much you're reducing the risk of Y in absolute terms. So the risk of me spontaneously combusting in absolute terms is incredibly low. And it also doesn't tell you what is the cost of the intervention targeting X. In this case, depleting oxygen from my environment, I'd suffocate and die. So, yes, it's an extreme example, but it's an extreme example that it highlights a very important point. I can say LDL and ApoB are causal for cardiovascular disease, and I can also maintain it does not follow that high ApoB and high LDL should be targeted and reduced in every circumstance, because causality is not equal to importance. So I'm going to pause there. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. You're the first person I've ever heard in the ketogenic environment to say that LDL can be causal in terms of atherosclerosis or heart attacks and strokes. But I think there is nuance there in terms of it depends on the other risk factors that that person has. So I'm guessing that if somebody's metabolically healthy, and by that we mean all other blood markers, HbA1c, triglycerides, high sensitivity C reactive protein, all these different things are in their normal ranges, but you have one marker elevated. In that case, you do not have to drastically reduce the LDL. Is that making sense there?
Yes. So, first of all, I'm not here to be prescriptive in either direction. What I'm trying to highlight here, another way to put it is just because something's causal does not mean it's sufficient. Just because something's causal doesn't mean it needs to be targeted. So you can come up with all sorts of analogies. Having a penis is probably causal for most STDs or getting somebody pregnant. I'm not going to engage in, contraceptive care by chopping off my man parts. Doesn't really make sense. So just because something's causal doesn't mean it needs to be targeted, treated. But the importance of acknowledging the causality of LDL and ApoB is if we really want to have discussions that move conversations forward, I will tell you that the verbal precision is incredibly important. So right now what we have is a giant rift between convention and then like the quote unquote counterculture, which, if we're going to generalize, and I hate when people do this to me, but I'm going to do it anyway, low carb keto community probably falls more on balance in that group. But when somebody in the quote unquote counterculture denies the idea that ApoB or LDL is quote unquote causal, it gives convention or conventionalists license to disregard them because they can say, oh, you don't understand the literature. And they're technically right because of the definition of the term. So it is more strategic to say, okay, I acknowledge causality, but causality does not equal importance. So we can continue to have this discussion and say, yeah, this is part of the causal cascade. Okay, agreed. But what is the actual relationship between this biomarker and plaque progression and cardiovascular disease risk in different people? Because the most least controversial thing, probably in cardiology right now, is that different people have different relationships between ApoB and LDL exposure and plaque progression. I say most controversial, least controversial, because it's controversial to say you can have high LDL, high ApoB, and be safe, quote unquote, from heart disease. But it's also like something that anybody with two brain cells to rub together knows, because there are examples of people. You can consider them outliers if you want, but they still exist. So we need to understand that with a greater degree of nuance. I hope that all makes sense. Because as soon as you say something like, oh yeah, I agree ApoB is causal, people shut down. I said this in my response video to Peter Attia, and then it's like a long thread on it, and people will just take that excerpt. Don't read this. Nick is now agreeing with Peter, yada, yada, yada. I'm like, about one thing, but like you have to, give people points for things that are accurate, and then you unfold the nuance.
So let me unfold that a bit. So if somebody's watching this and they're doing carnivore keto, and then maybe they have elevated LDL, maybe they have or haven't tested their ApoB. Now, we don't know other things about that person. But if that person is listening to you and they're thinking, oh my God, this is the first time I'm hearing about LDL and it could be bad, should that person be worried or should they be testing other things? In what sense is LDL a problem and then not a problem?
Worried is a strong term. I would say cautious. Let me speak about this from like a personal perspective. So my LDL as a lean mass hyperresponder on a keto diet is very high. I'm currently not treated. Does that mean I'm flippant about it or like this is nothing to worry about? No, not at all, because there are things we don't understand. People like me, in fact, the entire population of people with high LDL because of low carb diets, there have been no long-term studies on these people and cardiovascular outcomes. There just haven't been. So this is an area of unknown and we need to acknowledge that. It could be that we're at particularly high risk of cardiovascular disease or higher than is optimal. That could be optimized. It could also be that we're not at high risk. So it's an open question and we need to acknowledge that with some degree of humility, but it's also appropriate to ask the question, the counter question, well, what is the benefit? What is the known benefit of treating this marker in a population like me? And if we're being honest scientists, the answer to that question is we don't know. And that's the thing I would highlight, because I think a lot of conventionalists will say, well, we do know because of the quote unquote preponderance of evidence. This is a jargony term that basically means the mountain of pre-existing evidence points in a particular direction. My counter is, yeah, but the mountain of evidence was not collected in populations like me, lean people, low carb. So what use is the preponderance of evidence is if it was collected in a completely different population who has high LDL for very different reasons. So that's the point. And with that in mind, I'm going to give people a very unsatisfactory answer, which is that if you have high LDL and you're low carb and keto, I don't know your risk. I don't. And I also don't have a good way for you to determine with certainty your risk benefit analysis. I don't know what the cost of being on a statin or a PCSK9 inhibitor long term is. I can come up with ideas, and some of the data are a little bit fluffy, but there are areas of risk that are unknown. And I don't know what the cost will be in your particular circumstance of living for years or decades with very high ApoB. I don't know. And that's the truth of what medicine is. It's the art of making very difficult decisions with incomplete or imperfect information. So I'm not going to give a binary yes or no answer because I think that's inappropriate. And I think on both sides, that's where we get into trouble. So I would push the keto carnivore community who is very flippant about LDL to just consider the unknowns, because, it's to treat others how you want to be treated. That's also what we want from conventional scientists to say, actually, we don't know if statins are going to benefit you. We truly don't. And we don't know about the long-term risk of some of these other medications. So this is a difficult calculus, and what the individual decides to do with the data at hand should be respected. And it's often not, and I think that's where people get ticked off. So yeah, we could also say there are real side effects of the interventions that target ApoB. We could talk about side effects of statins that just don't get play. They just don't get play in the media that doctors aren't aware of. And these are also very relevant to consider for individuals. There was one paper out in Cell Metabolism we can talk about that when I read it, my mind was blown that it was not headline news when it came out, but it just flew under the radar for a year and a half until I started talking about it. And now it's popping off on all people I know, social media.
Now, as Dr. Norwitz points out, LDL cholesterol isn't so simple on a carnivore or a keto diet, and we really need to look at other tests, things like CAC scores or a fasting insulin test, to get the bigger picture about our cardiovascular health and our risk. But one thing that every expert agrees on when it comes to our health is our mental health. And I did a very important episode with Dr. Georgia Eid. She's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. She's also carnivore. And even she says that if you feel down, if you feel brain fog, if you feel anxious on most days, that is not a normal way of being. And I know this because I have felt this myself. You see, I have suffered from a mental health disorder from a very young age. It wasn't something that I could speak to my family or my friends about, but what I found completely fixed me, along with going keto and now carnivore, was to understand my thoughts and my emotions through therapy. And my therapist gave me so many practical solutions, things like diaphragmatic breathing and meditation. And the one technique that stood out was a self-soothing activity. One included rubbing my feet underneath a blanket. Now, this sounds small, but in moments of stress, the rhythmic touch really calmed my nervous system. And it's actually layering these techniques which help us feel calm and actually help me feel free and feel better. As you can sense, this has helped me a lot. And that is why I have BetterHelp as a sponsor of today's episode. Now, you don't need to have a mental health issue to benefit from therapy. And BetterHelp is on a mission to help you achieve any of your health goals. It could be things like dealing with stress or emotional trauma, or just sticking with a goal that you've set for this year. And one of the best things is it's really easy to get started. Simply fill out a questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. And if the first therapist doesn't feel quite right, you can easily switch to another one until you find someone you truly connect with. So if you feel that you're stuck or you're overwhelmed, you might want to consider therapy. Simply click on the link in the description of this episode or just head to betterhelp.com/primal podcast to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Dr. Sean Baker, when I spoke to him about a carnivore video, and when I asked a question about LDL, and I was asking, is LDL a concern if that's high on carnivore? And he said, look, we actually don't know. So there are other people saying this, and then you also have people saying, absolutely, LDL is not a problem, then other people saying, absolutely, it is a problem. So what I'm hearing from you is everybody has to be in N=1 experiment. I'm sure that people don't want to hear that. But as an example, if somebody has gone carnivore or done keto and their heart problem has been fixed, their gut problem has been fixed, or their thyroid issue has been fixed, they have to look at the primary concerns of that person and in the bigger picture, look at the risk factors, for example, for LDL. In that context, closing this discussion about LDL and whether it's a risk or not, do you think that would be a fair judgment so that people can understand sitting at home thinking, should I be concerned about myself and my LDL?
Yeah, I think it's a fair judgment. You are your N=1. I will caution that you're not going to feel a heart attack coming on. It's just going to happen. So, you can get imaging, cardiac imaging, to assess how much plaque you actually have. A CAC score is the most basic. It's going to be more useful if people are over 40. And then, consider what are your priorities. What are you treating? If you're keto or carnivore, what is it treating? Like, an example that might get some visceral reactions. If you have like debilitating schizophrenia and you go carnivore and it goes away, I would guess that person would say, yeah, I'll bet maybe losing a few years on my life to not have this debilitating mental health condition if I can stay on this diet and for whatever reason I'm not, tolerant of the pharmacotherapy. Like, that is a valid decision for a human being to make. That should be respected. But the same token, just consider what options are available to you. Like, if you went carnivore, to, lose body fat and you've gotten to a weight that you're happy with and your ApoB and your LDL is 500 and you can lower it to 100 by including like a mango a day after your workouts, seems like it might be a pretty benign option. I'm not here to tell you do or do not. I'm just saying there is a spectrum of options available, and it's up to the individual to decide what makes the most sense for them.
Wow, that is going to be very controversial. I'm very curious to see what people are going to say in the comments. I appreciate your response because nothing is ever clear cut, as we can see in the world of diet and in the world of health. Can I ask you about your egg experiment? So we spoke about the Oreo experiment. You did an egg experiment. Why did you do that one? Was it to see if your LDL is going to increase?
No, I knew it wouldn't. So here's the thing. This one, I don't know why it popped off. The story behind it was I was still pretty new to like generating YouTube videos, figuring out like what resonates with people. And a paper came out in Cell Metabolism about how cholesterol is regulated. We've known for a long time dietary cholesterol doesn't really impact cholesterol levels in the body for most people. And they discovered this hormone called cholecin. It's actually nicely named. It stands for cholesterol inhibitor. What happens is when you eat dietary cholesterol, your intestines say, hey, we got cholesterol. It sends this cholecin signal to the liver. It says, hey, pump the brakes on making more cholesterol because we just got it through the diet. That's the mechanism by which cholesterol levels stay stable when you eat things like egg yolks or other high cholesterol foods. And to be clear, people have done experiments that have been like published in top journals. I think there's one in the New England Journal where a guy ate 25 eggs, which is one more than I did per day. And his cholesterol levels didn't change. So it's not even new. But I did the review of the study and it was fine. The video got like 20K views or something. It was whatever. And then I thought, what if I wrap this around a self-experiment? I think people like to see when there's like a human narrative involved, not just dryly walking through the data. So I effectively just redid that data review of that paper, but instead of just leading with, hey, here's a paper, let me talk about it, I led with, I ate 720 eggs in a month and my cholesterol didn't change. you can see how the wrapping really changed the reception. So what ended up happening is that went like globally viral. I was getting interviews from people in like, South Korea, and it was really big in Korea, weirdly enough. Ended up doing a a little tour to India around the whole egg thing, talking with like Akon, the rapper, about eggs, like at a party in Pune with some billion. Like, it was a weird thing. It was popping. I don't even have TikTok, but people were sending me screenshots of like TikToks getting millions of views around it. So for me, it was a social experiment using the N=1 as a teaching tool. And it was just very interesting to me as a social experiment to say, look, I want to talk about the data, but how you tell the story around the data really makes a difference on how many people it's going to impact. The funny thing about it is, if you're in the know, it's not even a surprising result. Dietary cholesterol for most people, unless you're starting from like a vegan baseline, has very little impact on cholesterol. Generally, when you eat a higher cholesterol diet, you're changing other things, but the actual dietary cholesterol component usually doesn't have much, if any, impact. So if you go to a cardiologist or your GP and say, hey, will eating like dietary cholesterol increase my cholesterol? They probably already know the answer is no. So that was the funny thing about it. And I think it's just something about eggs that people still see it as like a nucleus of controversy. So that was it. It was metabolically far less interesting or novel than the Oreo experiment, but it did end up getting a lot more global play.
I thought it was fascinating, but explain exactly how you did it. So you ate 24 eggs a day. First of all, did you get sick of eating that many eggs a day? And did you eat anything else apart from the 24 eggs?
Yeah, I just need to eat 24 eggs so I could eat whatever else I wanted. It was actually the easiest N=1 I've ever done. The Oreo thing was painful. It was so unpleasant. I can't even tell you. But eggs? I mean, a dozen eggs, you can make like a nice big fat omelet with a dozen eggs, some cheese, some anchovies, some capers. Delicious. And there's so many ways to eat eggs. Deviled eggs, or boiled eggs, scrambled eggs with different forms of cheeses. I kind of scrambled eggs with manchego for lunch, and then scrambled eggs, dozen egg omelet with roquefort for dinner. You could have so many different meals with eggs, and I didn't get tired of eggs at all. And people are like, oh, that's so expensive. It actually doesn't end up being expensive if basically most of your diet is eggs. I know egg prices have gone up, but the overall diet is not that expensive if you calculate what is the cost of 24 eggs per day, for a month, and then you add on to that butter and cheese or whatever. So, yeah.
Interesting. I think people are fascinated about eggs. Anything about how to cook eggs and the price of eggs, or anything about eggs, they're very fascinated about. I did have a question. So in that experiment, you did that, but then you added in carbohydrates, and then your LDL went down, or it didn't change. So was that from the carbohydrates? And if you didn't add the carbohydrates, do you think that your LDL would have increased by eating so many eggs?
It was a 2-phase experiment. Phase 1 for a couple of weeks where I was just eating the 24 eggs per day. No LDL change. It was very stable. And then I added in the carbs. And for the same reason as the Oreos, it went down. So like phase 1 was, look, eggs don't change my cholesterol. And then phase 2 was, well, what if we pit an absurd amount of cholesterol in the diet against a little bit of carbs? Like a little bit, like some blueberries. And the blueberries overpowered the eggs. So that was kind of like an extra little bit of spice.
Okay, let's move on to understanding cholesterol, because even though you're doing all these experiments, you're trying to show that dietary cholesterol, the food that you eat, doesn't really have any correlation to your blood cholesterol. So if people are worried about cholesterol, they're freaking out about like, oh, my cholesterol, total cholesterol is high. Can we explain what is cholesterol? And does that, if you have a high cholesterol, is that going to lead to heart attacks and strokes?
So first question, what is cholesterol? Cholesterol is a biomolecule that is important for life. Most cells in your body can synthesize their own cholesterol. So it's not essential in the diet. Your body can make it. Your brain can make it. Your muscles can make it. Your fat cells can make it. Your liver can make it. And then cholesterol is trafficked around in the body on lipoprotein particles. There are many different flavors. When you hear LDL, that's just one type of particle that has cholesterol in it and traffics it around the body. So cholesterol itself is not a bad molecule. Nobody with 2 neurons to rub together thinks it's a bad molecule. In fact, if they're rubbing 2 neurons together, they have a lot of cholesterol in those neurons. I think the focus of terror and villainy is the particles that carry around the cholesterol in the blood. So those LDL particles belong to a class of particles called, and sorry for introducing all the jargon, but I think this is important to dissect, ApoB containing lipoprotein particles. So ApoB is a protein that helps give structure to these LDL particles and other particles maybe people have heard of, like Lp(a). It's like a cousin of LDL. And so, again, to break down what we're talking about here, there's cholesterol. It's a basic biomolecule used to synthesize many different things, coenzyme Q, steroids, hormones, parts of membranes. It's carried around in the blood on lipoprotein particles. One type is the LDL particle. So the LDL particle is a particle. LDL cholesterol is the cholesterol contained within the LDL particles. And if people hear ApoB, it is a protein associated with LDL particles. One ApoB, apolipoprotein per LDL particle. So those are what all the terms mean. And when it comes to the conventional point of view, lipid heart hypothesis, there's this idea that the LDL particles drive heart disease by getting into the artery wall and then seeding a plaque that grows. So it's not the cholesterol per se, it's the particle carrying the cholesterol. And it just so happens that, historically what you do is you can measure the cholesterol in these it's like what is easiest to measure and what's most conventionally measured. So the LDL cholesterol is like a poor man's proxy for the LDL particle count or the ApoB, again, because one ApoB per LDL. So those are what all those terms mean from a practical standpoint. I don't think anybody serious is suggesting that dietary cholesterol drives cardiovascular disease. I think that myth has basically been put to bed. I don't think anybody's primary care physician would actually challenge that idea, to be perfectly honest. There are other things in the diet that can modify cholesterol, even for your average person. So while the dietary cholesterol doesn't change cholesterol levels much, saturated fat can increase LDL levels. So it can increase the synthesis and then decrease the uptake of the particles carrying this cholesterol. So there's a little bit of a different story. I'll pause now to see if all that was clear.
It makes sense for me, but I'm thinking about the audience. So first of all, like when you said, honestly, if a physician would understand the difference between cholesterol and LDL, actually a lot of them don't. And a lot of them don't understand that terminology. If they see total cholesterol elevated on blood work, then they get freaked out, especially then if they see LDL, even if somebody's triglycerides are low. I know this because I have a carnivore keto group and I have so many people that say that they've done carnivore, their cholesterol's gone up, their LDL has gone up, triglycerides have gone down, my HDL has gone up, and all their other markers are fine and they're losing weight. And the doctor is trying to put them on a statin because not just the LDL, but they're looking at their total cholesterol as well. So that was one point. The second point is to unpack the LDL. So you mentioned the explanation about LDL, but I do want to spend a bit of time to understand the LDL, which is the lipoprotein. So it's like a sphere that is carried around in the blood because it's hydrophilic. So fat cannot go into the blood. It has to be in a sphere. So you have the LDL package, but then you hear this thing about like small dense LDL and large buoyant LDL. Is there a difference? And then how is that related to the particle size of the LDL?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the particle size, you kind of just said it, large and small. So large and small is the particle size. People like simple explanations. And so I'm going to tell you what I think is the wrong explanation that most people think. You get this picture in your mind, like a large, fluffy. Remember, we had this model where people think like the ApoB particles, the LDL particles, like crashing in through the artery wall and seeding a plaque. So I think people get this idea of like this small, dense, sneaky LDL like sneaking in to the artery versus the large, buoyant, just kind of like bouncing off like a marshmallow. It's not how it works. There's not like sneaking in through and then like bouncing around benignly. Instead, I would think about these patterns, having more large, fluffy or more small, dense, as fingerprints, metabolic proxies for the metabolic state that can influence cardiovascular risk. So if you have more large, fluffy, it's not really that the large, fluffy are just bouncing off the artery wall. It's just that if you have a preponderance of that relative to the small, dense, then you're probably metabolically healthy. It has to do with the turnover of these particles. So basically, you can think about it as like the large fluffy slowly decays and condenses into the small dense. So if you have more small dense, it means that the particles have been around in the blood longer. And that's an indication that you have a defect in turnover or uptake at the liver. And so, again, it's not that the small dense are bad per se, like intrinsically, and the large fluffy are benign per se intrinsically. It is that the pattern that occurs in any individual gives an indication of what else is going on metabolically. So if you do have a lot of small dense, the preponderance of small dense is called pattern B versus the preponderance of large fluffy, it's called pattern A. If you're pattern B, you probably have metabolic dysfunction. You probably have insulin resistance. You probably have high triglycerides. You might have low HDL. You might have a lot of visceral fat. So it's those things that are operating in the background, and actually knowing the preponderance of large fluffy versus small dense is kind of like it very closely associates with those other factors.
Now, as Dr. Norwitz mentions, it is the pattern of our LDL cholesterol that actually causes inflammation and increases our cardiovascular risk. But we also need to look at other markers of inflammation, things like C-reactive protein, fasting insulin, triglycerides. All of this is really important to understand your cardiovascular risk. But we need to fix our diet. And many experts will agree, including the likes of Dr. Ken Berry, that the first step is to drop the carbohydrates. Now, some people can drop the carbohydrates to under 50 grams a day, but some people need to even go as low as zero carb, or what's known as a carnivore diet. And with a zero carb or a carnivore diet, I have seen so many success stories. People reversing things like heart failure, thyroid issues, type 2 diabetes, losing so much weight, while their LDL cholesterol is a little bit high. And I experienced this myself when I went carnivore 5 years ago. And what I found helped me and my community stay on track was medical support through our carnivore doctors. And that is why I created a private online community. It's called Go Carnivore. It's completely off social media, and it's where you can ask all of your questions to all of the doctors, including the ones that you see here on this health podcast. And one of the best things about our community, we have our monthly challenges. We do things like our high fat challenge, our dairy free challenge, and our protein challenge. This is where our members get the best results. So if you want to try carnivore with the medical support, just head to gocarnivore.com and get your free 14-day challenge and your free meal plan. It's just so interesting that people say different things, because I did an interview with Dr. Zoe Harcum, and credit to her, she's amazing. But then she was saying she does not understand in the body how any LDL lipoprotein, whether it's HDL, LDL, can be bad. They all do jobs. And the way that she was describing it is that LDL comes from the liver and then deposits kind of cholesterol where it needs to in the lining of the arteries. And then what HDL does is that it transports that back to the liver to get recycled. Maybe that's a simplified version, but I think if you go more into the detail, then you can understand, okay, if they are small and dense, it is kind of like a symptom of even oxidized LDL, damaged LDL, and that tells a bigger story of metabolic dysfunction. Does that make sense of what I just said?
So I haven't heard your discussion with her, so I hope I'm not misrepresenting her perspective, but I have heard the idea that, the body's producing it, so why would the body want to kill us before? I think that's a logical fallacy. I think that's misleading thinking, and I'll give you an example. Let's say I am biking, and I fall off my bike, and I face plant and get a huge cut across my face. What's going to happen? Well, one thing that could happen is that cut could scar. I could have a massive facial scar for the rest of my life. Why did my face scar? Well, my body's trying to heal a cut on my face so I don't bleed out evolutionarily. Like, you just don't want to bleed. So like the body will do what it needs to do to help you survive, even if there's a cost. In this case, a giant scar on my face that I don't really want. And you can come up with all sorts of examples for this. The ApoE4 allele that has its benefits evolutionarily to improve reproductive fitness, that increases Alzheimer's disease risk. There are trade-offs that happen in our body all the time. A fitness benefit at one point in time, at a cost later. So cardiovascular disease is no different. So it's totally plausible that we have a system in our body that serves a function. I'm not saying it's functionless, but I'm saying in executing that role, there are trade-offs down the line. That is completely consistent with everything we know about evolution and biology. So there's a theme that's repeating where it's like I'm saying something and then you're highlighting how people are going to be confused and frustrated because they're hearing things that are diametrically opposed, and maybe I'm falling in the middle and trying to reconcile these things, but maybe it's too jargony to understand. What I would suggest to them is, one, be very cautious about listening to absolutists, and two, consider, is everything I'm saying just making basic sense? Because I get how it would be tempting to be like, oh yeah, why would the body be trying to kill us? But then listen back to what I just said. That actually gives an explanation for no, this is totally biologically understandable. It's not confusing at all. So absolutist statements, potentially misleading analogies like smoking causes lung cancer, therefore you should lower ApoB because it causes heart disease. People can wrap messages, and I'm not excusing myself from this group, like intentionally or unintentionally, in very seductive ways that sound compelling until you start to dissect them. And then you realize, no, there's other ways to see this that make total sense that aren't so dogmatic, and I find a little bit more interesting.
It's interesting. It's confusing as heck.
And I'll go on the record just now, sorry to interrupt, but like, if any of the people that you've talked to before or people on the other side want to debate me on this, I'll sit with Zoe, I'll sit with Lane, I'll sit with Peter Attia, I'll sit with Thomas Dayspring, I'll sit with Simon Hill, I'll sit with whoever wants to debate me on this and have an open conversation. I don't think anything I said, if people listen to the full context, should be controversial or people should be defensive about it. People might want to place emphasis in different places, but I don't think I've said anything that was inaccurate. I think I've represented the physiology and what we know, and more importantly, what we don't know, in a very accurate manner, in a transparent manner.
I'm just mindful that when I speak to, I think I've spoken to maybe over a few hundred people, and they all have like their different opinions. So I try to understand the big picture, and it appears that you've done the same thing to really understand not just the research, but the differing opinions. And when you have these absolutist, no, this is great, no, this is fine, this is not bad, we really have to question that. As you were saying, to close the LDL argument, it really depends on the pathophysiology of the LDL. No marker in isolation is fantastic or bad. As an interesting point, HDL by itself is not so protective against cardiovascular risk. Is that correct?
LDL is like, if you think of toys, when you have like a toy for like 2-year-olds where you have like the little circle you have to put in the circle hole, the square in the square hole, that's like LDL. By comparison, HDL is like a 10,000 piece 3D jigsaw puzzle. It's such a more complicated group of molecules. So there's many different flavors of HDL that serve many different functions. And so the HDL cholesterol fraction alone, it gives you very little information. I will say, like, at a population level, if your HDL is very low, especially in conjunction with high triglycerides, that is a marker of metabolic dysfunction. In fact, in metabolic syndrome, one of the 5 criteria is low HDL. So if you have an HDL of like 20 and, abdominal adiposity, probably an indication of not so good. But HDL cholesterol alone is not something I put a ton of stock in. When my HDL goes up, I have an explanation for why my HDL went from 50 to 120. And it fits part of a pattern. So it gives me information within that pattern. But the marker alone is not that informative.
Yes, when I heard about that, I thought that was very interesting, that looking at, so having a high HDL, exactly what doctors like to say, like might try to get your HDL very high. That's not really that protective against cardiovascular risk, heart attacks and strokes. It's really the entire picture. And I do want to talk about other advanced tests that people can do, so they're not left in lurch thinking, okay, he's saying the LDL is not a problem, the HDL, don't worry about that one. Well, what can I test? I do want to talk about one last thing prior to that, which is your experiments that you do and the papers that you do. You've published, I think, over 10 papers in this subgroup, this phenotype that you fit into, and I think I fit into, lean mass hyperresponder. Can we just briefly talk about that? What does that mean?
So lean mass hyperresponder, it actually is defined very simply. Remember, I was talking about patterns. LDL above 200, HDL above 80, triglycerides below 70, or at or below. Now, why is it called a lean mass hyperresponder if it's defined purely by these 3 cut points? Because this pattern, I've used this term already, but I'll use it again, is a metabolic fingerprint, a signature, an indication of some physiology underneath. So interestingly, the pattern almost exclusively appears in leaner and or metabolically healthy active people who go low carb. So if you go out in the general population, and we've actually done this in one of the studies, and you sample people, how many people will fit this triad? Almost none. We did in one of our studies a survey of NHANES. There was like 90,000 plus panels to pick from, and how many fit the lean mass hyperresponder triad? 3. 3 out of 90,000. Now, it's possible those 3 people were actually lean and low carb, because the time pool we sampled from, included, the general public. So probabilistically, maybe those 3 people were lean mass hyperresponders in that they were lean and low carb. We don't have that information. But the point is, this doesn't occur just by happenstance. However, among specifically people who are lean and low carb, this is actually very common. So general population, rare. Lean and low carb, very common. It's pretty predictable even. Like, we don't actually have the exact numbers on this, but my colleagues and I, Dave Feldman, Adrian Sotomoto, think, yeah, I could go to a gym, pick out people who have never done keto in their life, and just based on looking at them, say, I could turn you into lean mass hyperresponder in 6 weeks.
That's me.
So yeah, it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because what we're saying is, on visual inspection of somebody's body habitus from across the room, you could predict, if you could get their LDL levels to a point that is only otherwise known in rare genetic conditions. In my circumstance, my LDL gets as high as homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a 1 in 1 million genetic disease. So that's how weird this is, how interesting this is. And that's what lean mass hyperresponders are. We explained the mechanism, lipid energy model, fat trafficking a little bit earlier. The big question, though, is risk. Are these people at high risk? Studies are ongoing. The most recent tranche of data suggests the population as a group is quite heterogeneous. Some people have plaque progression, some people don't have plaque progression. Some people even have plaque regression. But I think the more important point is that the predictor of plaque progression, what is it? It's not the usual suspect. It's not LDL. It's not ApoB. That's not predicting plaque progression. And we can talk about the criticisms of this study. Some of them are pretty hilarious. But what does predict plaque progression is pre-existing plaque. So plaque can kind of snowball. There's various reasons for this. But simply put, yeah, if it's known, plaque can kind of snowball. So if you have baseline plaque, it can generate more plaque over time. So that's the idea of plaque predicts plaque. But LDL and ApoB do not in lean mass hyperresponders. So if people want the newest bit of data on that, I did do an interview with my co-author and colleague Dave Feldman, who people listening probably know, on my YouTube channel. So people want clarity on that, because I know there's a lot of confusion about the keto CTA study people have been following. That provides some clarity. The long story short is, heterogeneous risk population, ApoB and LDL do not predict plaque progression. Baseline plaque predicts plaque progression. And we're continuing to study this group. There will be more literature in time. And once again, for those detractors who have strong opinions about this, we can have a discussion. Because I think a lot of people commenting, I'll be frank, don't know what the heck they're talking about. It's true. Shooting attack, I can give examples, are hilarious. We have Simon Hill and Lane Norton popping off about how there isn't enough of a response effect. So they're like, oh, they all have high ApoB. And so you're not actually getting enough dose variance to look for a relationship between ApoB and LDL. And Dave actually pointed this out, so I'm echoing him in his conference talk. But he's like, oh, you're saying we don't have enough of a dose variance. This study has the highest dose variance of any prospective study ever published. So saying high equals high is like saying, a chubby corgi and Godzilla have the same destructive power because they're both quote unquote big. It's a ridiculous argument that has become a meme in and of itself, because people just parrot other people and then don't take responsibility for what are weak arguments, nor do they sit down and actually have a discussion with the people doing the research. They just want to score points by attacking keto, which is, my impression is that is their motivation. I can't know. I don't know their pure intent, but I do think it's conspicuous when weak arguments are parroted by people who also are not currently interested in engaging with the research team doing the studies. So My 2 cents. Those gentlemen want to have a conversation. I'm very happy to.
Or I would be very scared to have a conversation with you because you can back up everything. As can Lane Norton, like he's very, I guess all these people that are in their realm and study what they study, they can really back up what they say. And then we are just left very confused about what to do. And then you have people are just like, okay, you know what? I have been carnivore for 5 years. I have high LDL. It's actually over 500, but everything else is fine. It has fixed so many different chronic health issues that I had, including mental health issues. But then you have other people that I've heard reversing heart failure, thyroid issues, type 2 diabetes, all these things. And if that protocol has helped them and they have maybe elevated LDL, as we spoke about earlier, what is the preceding importance? Fixing your chronic health condition, but also having that LDL parameter in the background. I just want to mention that what you mentioned was the Keto CTA study, which was in 2025. You did do a video last week. I'll link that in the show notes. But that was basically looking at over 1 year LDL-C and ApoB, which was not correlated with cardiovascular risk or plaque progression. Instead, baseline plaque, which you said was the strongest predictor of future plaque growth. So in case people want to know, I'll pop that in the show notes. Also, your video, which was really good with Dave Feldman. So I do want to ask about, maybe we can talk about just quickly triglycerides. We haven't really spoken about that. Is that an indicator of cardiovascular risk, heart attacks and strokes?
Yeah, it is. Again, I keep on coming back to this term. Sorry to beat a dead horse on it, but I think metabolic fingerprint, metabolic signature. I would say if you have elevated triglycerides in the fasting state, it is a good indicator of poor metabolic health. It doesn't mean you need to your triglycerides down to 20 or 10. But your triglycerides, I think below 100 fasted is good. Below 70 fasted is great. And maybe I shouldn't say this, but I will say it. You mentioned Lane Norton. I feel very strongly, I do not think he can back up everything he says. I think he often cites studies that he just does not understand. And if you want me to throw the gauntlet down right now, if he's listening, I think I can make a very strong case he is not competent on this issue. So the backstory is we tried to collaborate with him early on. So we talked about the Oreo study. I reached out to him because I knew we didn't want to cover it. I reached out to him before it was published. Say, hey, I have this coming out. If you want, I'm happy to build a bridge with you. Look at the study. Just give me your thoughts. I will acknowledge you in the paper. He passed on that. And then we had a whole discussion about the meta-analysis of randomized control trials we did. Now, anybody who knows Lane knows he loves to talk about how much he loves to cite the human randomized control trials. So he asks us questions. We respond to these questions in good faith. In a group chat, we go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And he's very polite in the group chat. And we had a good exchange. We offer to have discussions on his platform. We offer to get a colleague lipidologist on his platform. What he then ends up doing is a solo video where he completely ignores all the RCT level data, focuses on the Oreo versus statin study, messes up on the physiology. I have screenshots of me explaining to him the answer to a question that he asked that he then screws up on. Again, brushing the RCT data under the rug. And then in his video at the end, he asks for feedback. Real time, I give him feedback. It was a couple of days later. I remember seeing the video. I was between duties at the hospital on a small lunch break. I just put my phone down on a napkin holder and recorded my response video. You can watch it. I provide receipts for everything I say. I call out what I think is some inappropriate bullying behavior and bullying behavior. And again, you can see the screenshots of all the tweets. Don't call him names, but then I correct him on some issues. He never responded on the issues of the data. He subsequently blocked me. He then went mum and started to spread false rumors about me, lies, behind the scenes. I let him have it. I decided, you know what? If you're swearing off me on social media, which he did, he threw what I can only describe as a tantrum, and they say he'll never engage with me on social media again. I just let him have it. So even though he was spreading lies about me, describe what the lies are, I just, went for it. He has since come out and commented on Keto CTA and other matters. Again, made what I would consider embarrassing errors, refused to engage, and only doubled down on his lie, which was, and this is now, I'm not revealing anything new because he went off and tweeted about it a tweet I found out about when I went to the dentist. And the dentist like, why is Lane Norton saying Nick Norwitz should go F word himself? And he has this big diatribe about this lie that I know is a lie, and I'm surprised he even came out about it, which was that I viciously attacked him when his mother was sick. So what happened was he decided to do his solo coverage of our data, ignoring the RCTs and messing up on the physiology when his mother was sick. He admitted to this. So he chose to be on social media at that time. I then responded in real time on the matters of the data. And if you want to just see how absurd and ironic this is, the only link he originally remembered to put in was not the link to our studies, but a link to sell his Data Over Feelings t-shirt, which he was plugging in the video. You can't make this up. There are screenshots, there are timestamps, there are receipts. It's all laid out. So Data Over Feelings, I mean, I'm for living by that. It does not seem like he is. He knows some things, but he definitely speaks very loudly and confidently on things that he does not know anything about, or let's say does not know much about. And then he refuses to actually hold himself to account for what are frank errors and omissions in his data coverage, and thinks he can get away with it because he has a big megaphone.
Well, firstly, I don't know if Lane Norton watches my podcast, because he'll see a lot of things about like eating butter and fat and like all the things about carnivore and keto and how it's so great for your health. But secondly, your motto is to stay curious. And I think that, and even that's my motto, where I am a curious person and I like my audience to be curious. Oh, there we Are you flexing right now? Or are you showing me your tattoo?
My tattoo. It's my only tattoo. It's stay
Honestly,
curious.
I thought you were just flexing. You're like, look at my muscle.
No. That's why I got a tattoo on my bicep before Thanksgiving. It's stay curious. I got it with my karate sensei from age 4. It's something I've lived by my entire life, so I decided to print it on my body.
So just for the audience to appreciate that on social media, as with every other thing, especially doctors, you're going to have people that have very strong opinions. And usually the people that can speak well, or they're the loudest, or they're the strongest, their voice tends to be heard, especially on social media. And if you're very extreme, as we've seen with your Oreo experiment and your egg experiment. But what people need to do is to delve into what makes sense for them. And that goes into my next question. Ketogenic diets, carnivore diets, who should do those types of protocols?
I think it's fine for anybody to experiment with if they're motivated and curious. My bias, and I will highlight this as a bias, that I'll claim my own history. Ketogenic diet basically saved my life, probably did save my life from pretty debilitating inflammatory bowel disease. It would be inauthentic to say that doesn't color my perspective of this intervention. So while I'm not evangelical about it, it does color my perspective. And so I would say anybody struggling with an autoimmune, inflammatory, metabolic health condition should consider this in their arsenal of tools to try. They should find support to do it right, to troubleshoot any hiccups that might come up along the way. But my perspective is what do you have to lose? If you're someone who's suffering with something that conventional approaches have not been sufficient to address, to give it a rigorous 6 to 8 week try, maybe you'll miss bread for a couple months. Maybe it'll change your life. It did for me. I guess that's about all I'd say on it, is that trying a diet doesn't mean you have to stick for the rest of your life. But if you're someone with something substantial to gain, something substantial to treat or cure, why not?
So question for you. Do you think that the carnivore diet for people that have a health problem, do you think that's going to be healthy longer term?
It depends on what outcome you care about. I brought the example up before about say debilitating schizophrenia. I do not think we have evidence this is just carnivore diet as longevity diet, and maybe it'll shorten lifespan. It's possible. We just don't know. There aren't populations that are long-term full carnivores. I know there are populations that are, animal-based, but full carnivore, we don't have data on that. So maybe it'll shorten your life. I don't know. I wouldn't recommend it as a longevity diet. But if you are someone who has a debilitating condition and you try this and it transforms your world in life, that's important. So can it improve your health long term? Well, I mean, if you reverse diabetes, psoriasis, lupus, and you're living a happy, healthy life, it's always a cost benefit analysis. I'll give you like the personal example is inflammatory bowel disease. Now I eat meat. I don't eat a ton of meat, but let's say even if I were carnivore, people are like, well, the meat's going to increase your colon cancer risk. I'm like, do you know what the risk of having active inflammatory bowel disease is on colon cancer? I guarantee you, even if a steak is increasing my risk at all, it is way less than having active inflammatory bowel disease. So in this case, the actual risk reduction is a lot, not a risk increase. So these things don't have straightforward answers. I think it's possible a carnivore diet could be healthy long term. I think it's possible it could shorten your lifespan. It's up to you. It's always about like, what is it replacing? How is your body changing? What matters to you? So you're going to find I'm a guy who rarely gives black and white answers. When I do, they stand out. And I do that for a reason. And so if people want the one liner that you should do this, I'm just not your guy to follow. I'm not, because this is how I think about things, but it's also how I want to challenge people to think about things, because this is the only way that I believe people can actually be guaranteed to progress along their metabolic health journey. Not just taking words as gospel from other people, but thinking critically about what are the variables that matter to me? How do different interventions impact these variables? And putting it in your N=1 context. So my entire life's mission now is to excite people about metabolic health and teach them to think that way about their own life. That is why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's not to evangelize about any particular diet. It's to empower people with the tools at their disposal and say, look, you can be at the helm of your metabolic health ship. And I get goosebumps just thinking about it, because it took me so long to figure that out. And when I did, my life completely changed. And I want that for other people.
Oh, that's so nice. What do you think are the best foods that people should eat if they really want those nutrient-dense foods to change their life?
I mean, I don't think any one food is necessary, but eggs are pretty freaking nutritious. I would say eggs are going to be up there. So I say no one food is necessary. As in, if you don't like eggs, you can be perfectly healthy without eggs. But eggs are incredibly nutritious. I think fatty fish, I do feel very strongly that like having a decent amount of omega-3s, primarily from marine sources, EPA and DHA is good for you. So sockeye salmon, I wouldn't go for the farm stuff, pretty high in various toxins. Sardines, little whole organisms, so like shellfish, oysters, mussels, are going to be very nutrient dense. I am a fan of organ meat. Like I like heart, I like liver. Some people are worried about liver and hypervitaminosis, like high vitamin A. I would say it's usually pretty self-limiting. Like you start to get like sick of liver before you're going to get vitamin A toxicity, unless you're eating polar bear liver, which is basically poisonous because of very high concentrations of vitamin A. But I'm hoping nobody's eating polar bear liver. Anyway, we know this from like Arctic explorers who like died from eating polar bear liver. But yeah, I like liver. Probably like 200 grams per week is what I eat. And then, beyond that, I can go through like my favorite fat source is probably extra virgin olive oil, like a good extra virgin olive oil. I like cooking with ghee, also sometimes coconut oil, also sometimes macadamia oil. Ghee though is, if people want a fun fact, between ghee and butter, the smoke point of ghee is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit higher because it's a clarification process. Removing the milk solids massively increases the smoke point. Plus I like the nutty flavor. Fermented foods, fermented dairy like kefir. I'm a fan of A2 dairy over A1. The A1 casein proteins can be inflammatory, cause GI upset. It actually gets chopped up in the gut into an opioid compound, beta-casomorphine 7. So they've done like RCTs where they compare just A1 and like an A1, A2 combination, which is like normal cow dairy, to just A2 casein, say from milk. And the A2, even in the double-blinded RCTs, causes way less GI discomfort. So if you're someone who's like dairy sensitive, maybe worth considering. It might not be lactose intolerance, and stay away from cow dairy and do A2, which is sheep, goat, buffalo. And they have some special cows that are just A2, but there's a fun fact there. Yeah, it's my short list.
Brilliant. That's all the foods that I love. I tend to stick with the carnivore stuff, not really into the vegetable stuff. But again, that's just what's really, really helped me. Last question for you. Although LDL is not a good predictor of cardiovascular risk, what are some tests that people can do, whether it's CT angiography, CAC score, anything?
I think having cardiac imaging is good, even as a baseline. The basic one is a coronary artery calcium scan. You mentioned it, a CAC score. I would take it with a grain of salt if you're below 40. Above 40, it does provide a warranty if the value is zero, at least for a period of time. It doesn't mean you don't have any plaque. For that, you can get a coronary CT angiography, which looks at both calcified and softer plaques. It's a little bit more advanced test, a little bit more radiation, although not a ton, given modern scanning technology. Another marker that is not LDL, Lp(a). It's mostly genetically determined. There are some things you might be able to do to reduce risk. There was actually a recent paper out in 2025 showing that people with low waist to hip ratios with high Lp(a) appear to be at much lower risk than maybe we previously thought. So again, metabolic health at the foundation of everything. I think, everybody should know their fasting insulin level, ideally aiming for below 5. And then you can get a HOMA-IR score, which is a insulin resistance metric if you have the fasting glucose with the fasting insulin. Maybe some markers of inflammation, and HSCRP is the most general one. You can also get cytokine panels. Those are more expensive to get. You can get markers of oxidative stress. Myeloperoxidase is one, also associates with body fat. Fat actually secretes this enzyme that's oxidizes things, like oxidizes fatty acids, oxidizes PUFAs, oxidizes LDL, and it's secreted by fat tissue. So you can get a myeloperoxidase that can be measured, secreted by fat tissue, among other things, immune cells, and MDA. The list goes on. But I think everybody should know fasting insulin, marker of inflammation, HSCRP.
Thank you for joining me today this episode with Dr. Nick Norwitz. Now, our internet connection cut out at the end, but I do want to say that thank you, Dr. Norwitz, for a very robust conversation. As you can see with the carnivore and keto world, sometimes we see things that challenge our common beliefs. But one thing that is really important is to stay curious and to stay open and really challenge anything that you hear. And to that end, if you have any questions about LDL cholesterol or anything that was brought up in this conversation, please leave it in the comments and I will make sure to answer all of your questions. And if you enjoyed this episode, you'll enjoy another episode I did with Dr. Zoe Harcum. She talks about everything cholesterol, HDL, LDL, and gives you a very comprehensive picture about cholesterol. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.